Okay, good. So, I have 2 books here by this gentleman, and I will let him introduce himself, as he is my guest here tonight to talk on the Tiger One, myths and the misconceptions and the muck. We're going to clean it all up, blow it all apart, and then get the history there. So, why don't you introduce a little bit about yourself and a little bit about your background, what you do, and what you're here to talk about today?
Yeah, well, I'm so excited because what better thing to do during a lockdown over COVID-19 than to talk about it. So I'm very glad to see you, Sophie, and to talk with you again. So my name is Bruce Oliver Newsome, and I'm talking to you from San Diego, where I teach at the University of San Diego. I'm a political scientist and a military scientist. And so I started in tanks as a soldier. So I actually served on M1 Abrams tanks in the U.S. Army Reserve. I served in the British Army too, so I'm a dual citizen, British American. Served in the British Army actually as an air mobile infantryman, and then I did my Ph.D. in international strategic studies, focusing on military capabilities. Then I joined a federally funded research and development center called RAND, actually at the California office, where I did work mostly for the Department of the Army on acquisitions, ground maneuver capability acquisitions, so how the M1 Abrams might be improved or might be better configured for the new types of warfare that the US Army was confronting back then. So this was in the middle of the 2000s, so this was at the height of the wars in Afghanistan, Iraq. Other acquisitions, other weapon acquisitions, trainings, how to train soldiers better, particularly how to make use of games. As it happens, I am not a gamer, but I've done a lot of work for the US Army on how to make use of games in training. So I know a lot about games in theory and not a lot about games as a user. At least militarily useful training games. And then, so I finished at RAND. I went and joined the Defense Academy of the United Kingdom, where I was on the teaching faculty at the Defense Academy at Shrivenham, which has its own tank collection of some merit. I know, Sophie, you've been there and done some broadcasts. You've done some videos there, at least. I've seen those. So Defense Academy, then I joined University of Pennsylvania. I taught an international relations program there. Then I went to UC Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley, and now I'm at University of San Diego. So that's me in 30 seconds.
Awesome. That was a good... Yeah, there's a lot of life. There's a lot of stuff there to talk about, but I think that was an excellent and very succinct introduction. So, again, this is not one of my gamer pals. This is the real deal, and we're going to be talking a little bit about the real deal as well. So, I went ahead and put a list of questions from a posted prompt on my Discord about the Tiger One. How can we hear about this tank from the expert? Because this is one of the most popularly discussed tanks. This is one of the more famous tanks, especially Tiger 131. If you go into any tank forum on Facebook or group online, people are going to be talking Tiger One. And there's a lot of stuff thrown up around about it. Some of these are very favorable things, and some of these are very unfavorable things. A lot of them are very generalized, and a lot of them are repeated very often. You run into the same stuff, and it's kind of hard for a tank enthusiast, especially somebody kind of just getting started. They dig tanks, and they just want to learn, and it's kind of hard for them to weed out the nonsense. So, kind of want to take a look at that closely, and what inspired me to do that was receiving these copies of your books and how things were so well laid out, from how did the Allied forces find the Tiger? And then what they discovered through their testing, I think, dispels a lot of the generalized random things that were thrown around, and that the ways that things were laid out here really helped me instantly, like, oh, that actually, like, that, and now that I'm reading this, but everybody says this, like, that makes perfect sense, actually, and it's well sourced. So we could probably talk Tiger One forever, but what I wanted to do was, from your research, what's true and what's not about the stuff that you're going to hear about this tank all the time.
Yeah, well, the thing with any... Sorry, I stepped on your transmission there. There are extreme views on tanks, and these extremes are not necessarily evidence-based. So So picking one extreme doesn't necessarily make you doesn't indicate that you're necessarily moving in the right direction, because even if the extremes are correct, they are not necessarily evidence-based. So what really differentiates is the attempt to be evidence-based, and that's why it's taken so long. And frankly, if I'd known how difficult it was to really prove what is true about the tiger, I might not have started the project in the first place. It's just because there's the missing data for one thing. So much is destroyed in the German archive. So much is missing, and then the real root cause of these extreme views of the tiger in particular is because you've got the intelligence, which tends to be more complementary than the propaganda. So you've got this bifurcation between the intelligence and the propaganda, and often the intelligence is more informative than what survives in the German archives. It doesn't mean that the Germans, we can't infer much from the absence of evidence that the Germans were missing anything about their own tank. It's just that their own test reports are not existing, their trial reports are not existing. So we have to go to test reports of particularly Tiger 131 to find out things that we can't find in the German archives themselves. So ironically, it's the enemies, in this case the Western Allied intelligence on the German tank, in this case the Tiger, it's ironically often the Western Allied intelligence on the tank that is more informative than what survives in the German archives. Now, so credit to the intelligence people, but then the propagandists at the same time, in current time during the war, they would mess with this, and they would put out stupid things like, so speed is a good example. So the Tiger tank had a really impressive turn of speed. So it's actually faster than most medium tanks on the enemy side. So it was pushing 30 miles per hour. So 28 miles per hour was its official specified speed. That was really good for the time. And actually, it's still respectable today. But of course, the propagandists got hold of the weight, and they said they had many specifications they wanted to turn on their heads and make out that the Tiger was underperforming on these different dimensions, because they wanted to reassure their Allied soldiers that what was going around in Allied in the front line, in hearsay, in the rumor as a super weapon. The propagandists wanted to reassure everybody that it was a rubbish tank. So they would say the speed was, it was barely walking pace, or typically it's reported 12 miles per hour, 15 miles per hour. So it's pretty much half the speed, half of its real speed. And the propaganda has tended to dominate in the secondary sources. So what we think of as history books, it's actually the propaganda, at least in the English language history books, that's tended to dominate, and the intelligence has sort of got forgotten. So that really surprised me in the research. And you get horrendous bifurcations still, where things just don't add up. Speed, power to weight ratio, and that speaks to how some of the measures that we use to actually evaluate tanks can be wrong. So, for instance, let's take power or weight. No, let's take weight. So this is easier. This is true for any military scientist. So if we're evaluating tanks today, so what's the best tank today? Our measures are not perfect, and we have to make choices. And sometimes people make deliberately biased choices to make a tank look good or bad. Now, you take weight. So everybody should be familiar that in the propaganda, Tiger is constantly rubbished as being heavy. So then it would sink into the mud, and that's one of the reasons why it went walking pace, because it was so heavy you couldn't power it. But actually, it had a very powerful engine, and it had a high power to weight ratio. So the power to weight ratio is much more informative than weight, and that's why it was fast, and that's why a Tiger could tow another Tiger tank. It had a reserve of power, and it was reasonably reliable too, and that's something that also surprised me. Difficult as it is to measure reliability 70 years ago, there's plenty of evidence that this was a reliable tank, and that's going to surprise a lot of readers too. But it makes sense because it had a high power to weight ratio. And we know from current research, right? So I've done this research on current tanks. The main predictor of reliability in tanks is a high power to weight ratio. There are other things like accessibility of components and ventilation of the engine compartment, things like that. So there's some observable indicators of when a tank will be reliable, even before you start actually pushing it in reliability trials. But the indicators are on Tiger's side. It should be a reliable tank. Plenty of ventilation space in the engine compartment, high power to weight ratio, highly accessible components, high engineering standards in Germany at the time and since. So you know, whenever we think about Tiger, we've got to be very disciplined about whether we're actually thinking of evidence or whether we're thinking about propaganda, because they're so bifurcated.
Okay, well, let's start clearing away some of the clouds. And I think that it's great that you brought up reliability, because that is reliability in general. And then there's like a couple of things that I want to touch on that I hear all the time, just repeated and repeated and repeated, said very plainly and very emphatically as like, oh. So let me open some of the questions, because some really good questions were asked by my community about the Tiger's reliability specifically, because I think that's one of the biggest ones. So let's see here. I really liked this one. So one of the followers asks, a misconception is that Germany neglected to make Tiger 1 suitably reliable, and that it broke down all the time as a result of poor design. However, the Tiger 1 was designed with a specific role in mind, and under ideal conditions would see regular maintenance. Could you expand on the role Tiger 1 was intended to fill, and what happened after it was forced outside of its intended doctrine and after German logistics started to break down?
Yeah, well, so there's almost two questions there.
Yes.
If I can keep those straight in my head. So there's a sort of doctrinal question, and it is true that the Tiger was used outside of its initial doctrinal requirement, which made it, which would make it less reliable. It would appear to be less reliable than it truly was. So, for instance, it was supposed to be an offensive assault tank, but in practice, it's almost always used defensively, just because of its timing of introduction. Germany is on the wane, so it's having to respond to Allied attacks. So it's having to it's in a counterattack role, or it is shooting and scooting, or it's trying to denude an attacking force and escape backwards from that attacking force at the same time. So if it has any reliability problem, or it has a wheel shot out or a broken track or something, it's going to possibly get overtaken by the Allies, and it's going to appear like an unreliable tank captured. And really, that's a strategic outcome. It's not a mechanical outcome. So those outcomes are often confused, and they're easy to confuse for biased reasons. So it is true, the propaganda at the time deliberately confused that, because it was convenient to pretend that this tank was unreliable. So you see lots of propagandist images at the time saying, you know, here's a perfectly intact tank, but it ran out of fuel because it doesn't carry enough fuel, or it broke down, it had to be abandoned, and missing the fact that this is a general retreat, and the Germans are generally abandoning their heavy weapons, whether they're reliable or not, because personnel are making rational decisions to escape. You know, it could be over the river Seine in Normandy, without bridges, without ferries to take those tanks. That's a logistical problem. It's not Tiger's problem. You can't pin that on Tiger. So that's the doctrinal side of it. And then in terms of design, so this tank was designed to be reliable. I mean, the Germans specified a highly powerful engine in the beginning, and actually specified a 600 horsepower metric horsepower engine for what was going to be a lighter tank in the beginning, in 1938. And even though the weight of the tank rose from 35 to 57 metric tons, despite that, it still had the most powerful tank engine of the Second World War, and it still had a reasonably high power-to-weight ratio. Certainly in its class, it had a very high power-to-weight ratio. So compare, Churchill tank, which was a lot slower and a lot less powerful. So the Germans were they were not seeking to make any trade-offs in reliability. It was not as if they said to themselves, "We're going to have a heavy tank and we're going to sacrifice reliability." It's not true. And you can compare lots of situations, particularly in Britain, where British procurers were sacrificing reliability. They were saying, "This engine isn't even proven, but it's convenient for the supplier, the assembler of this tank, for them to put their own engine in it," because it was just that British procurement was so chaotic and corrupted, to be frank, that procurers were allowing somebody to design a tank and put their own engine in it because they had commercial advantage in doing so. And the procurers were saying, "It's an unproven engine, but for the sake of getting this tank to the front quickly, we'll accept the inevitable reliability problems," right? That's the British side. The Germans are not making those deliberate sacrifices of reliability. They attempted a reliable tank, and they got a reliable tank. From the evidence that I've gathered, they've got a reliable tank. And just because I keep saying it's reliable, I'll just give one datum to make that clear. So the evidence I've gathered is that this tank had an scheduled overhaul rate of 5,000 kilometers, which is more than 3,000 miles. And in my research, there's not a single Western Allied tank or Soviet tank which is reaching that.
What was the more usual one for the vehicles from the other groups?
Yeah, so well, I can give you the upper bound. So the upper bound on the Western Allied side was the M4A2, which had a diesel engine, and which it was actually the most reliable of the Sherman. So M4A2 Sherman, it's getting. I'm going to check with the exact figure here.
Which one of your books is that one from? I'll take a look.
So it's this one. It's Volume 4, Capabilities and Performance. Volume 4 in the series on Tiger Tank and Allied Intelligence.
Okay.
So I've got a table of overhaul rates here on page 49. And so M4A2, it's getting overhauled around 2,000 miles. And Tiger is designed, from what I can tell, to be overhauled at slightly more than 3,000 miles. That gives you an idea. When the M4A2, the Sherman generally is said it is touted as a reliable tank. It was touted at the time as reliable, and is consensually accepted in the literature as reliable at 2,000 miles between overhauls. We got the Tiger, which is getting 3,000 miles between overhauls.
Okay, can you clarify overhaul?
Yeah, so that would be a base echelon strip and reassembly, at least of the automotive compartment.
Okay, so we're talking new engine, new transmission.
No, well, could be. Not necessarily a new one. It could be you just take the engine out, you strip it, you clean it, you replace anything that is overly worn, right? So some moving parts that may be worn would be maybe piston heads. You'd replace the spark plug, so electrical components tend to foul up quicker than the mechanical components. You wash it of all the old lubricants and greases and so forth. You re-grease everything and put it all back together. So that would be a strip and assembly, and you do that with your auxiliary components, so the fan drives, the oil pumps, the air pumps. You put in the electrical motors for the fans. You would certainly change those because again, electrical components tend to foul up quicker than base mechanical components. And you'd clean the fuel lines, might change the fuel lines, might change the fuel tanks, and correct anything that might have been damaged through normal wear and tear or enemy action. Right, so that would count as an overhaul.
From the chart. Yeah, so it shows the difference. There's a table that has the mean distance between overhauls of British tanks, US tanks, and Soviet tanks, and those are from their own reports from their own theaters.
Yeah. So So that sort of evidence is difficult to find, so it doesn't survive well. But what the reports, with the most useful reports, so you do sometimes find overhaul rates in other forms of document, but the most useful are the regular, say, 6 monthly mechanical or technical specialist reports from the operational theatre to the Home Authority. So say Middle East Command, British Army's Middle East Command, that covers, well, it's most active in Egypt, Libya, but it covers the Arabian Peninsula and East Africa. So it's got technical specialists. They're supposed to report regularly, usually around 6 months, and their reports are usually complaints about the unreliability of British tanks. And you can see one of the measures of unreliability is mean distance between overhauls. Another measure you sometimes see is mean distance between breakdown. And for some of the British tanks, they're unbelievably unreliable. As in, say, take this first models of Crusader. So the Cruiser 6 Crusader, which gets introduced on the front line November 1941, it's not getting 200 miles between failures. And there's a massive rebuild program, and civilian technicians are flown out to Egypt, and they radically redesign the engine, and they make the materials more robust. And you get as quoted here, you get 250 miles between overhauls, right? Which means that's pretty much in the vast expanse of the Egyptian Libyan deserts. That's pretty much one operation. You're going to put your tanks out for a couple of days, 3 days, and then send them back to Cairo for overhaul, or they're just going to break down on the battlefield, and you can hope to overhaul them, an equivalent overhaul on the front line, or you just delete them. And the Allies delete a lot of tanks which are in theory repairable, but it's much easier to just get a replacement tank. That's how they solved a systemic unreliability problem.
So what was the when you mentioned there's mean distance between breakdowns as one of the things that are looked at, what was that like for the Tiger 1?
I don't know. So I would love to find that data. I found no indicators of that. But what I can say is I found no complaints, right? That's pretty good evidence, right? So the German users of the Tiger tank are not reporting complaints about Tiger having a high breakdown rate. And if Tiger was unreliable, there should be those user reports.
Were there user reports like that for other German tanks?
No, well, German tanks are generally reliable. You will get certainly complaints in the mid-1930s about the reliability of Panzer I. That's not an issue in wartime. So generally, German tanks are regarded as reliable by their own users. And certainly the Tiger tank is whether there are some reports that I actually quote in this book by some, I think it's 504th Battalion, saying Tiger tank is more reliable than the other Panzers we've received, we've been issued. So it's more reliable than Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs. And again, think about the theoretical reasons for that. It had a high power to weight ratio, is a much bigger tank, there's much more accessibility, and there's much more ventilation. Even though countervailing that, you've got higher weight, you've got probably you can expect a more demanding operational cycle, because these tanks are being put in assault roles, so they're the ones that have to take on the most difficult terrain, and they have to do a lot of maneuvering around fortifications, and maybe they have to escape from failed attacks more often. But despite these challenges for this particular model of tank, it is not appearing in the user reports as unreliable.
One
right?
of the
So I can't.
things that I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, no. Well, it's tragic. I think it's tragic for history that we don't, or at least I have not yet found any data on mean distance between failures. But I think it is. What's the right word? I think uh, it's remarkable that we have no user complaints, and that should have been noted as good evidence in the past. So other people have read these same user reports and not not realize the significance of the absence of evidence, right? So there's an absence of evidence for the tank being unreliable, apart from the propaganda, which says on the Allied side is going to say it's unreliable. There's an absence of evidence for it being unreliable. Why wasn't more significance given to that absence of evidence?